Hi, boys and girls. I am going to review with you some of the problems from lesson 12, and it's about using benchmark fractions. Now, when you use a benchmark for anything, what you're doing is you're taking something that you know and measuring it against something that maybe you don't know or maybe something you want to learn more about. We do it in reading all the time. We kind of, always see how you're reading compared to other readers and other ways of reading. So those are called benchmarks for reading. So now we're using benchmark fractions. We're using a half. So by now in 4th grade, you should have a pretty good understanding of what half means. So if you have 6 pieces of candy, half of that is 3 pieces of candy. So you understand what's less than half and what's more than half. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to first start by looking at 0 to 1 as one whole and understanding halfway as if you're traveling down that number line. If you got to halfway and kept going, you'd pass and go farther than halfway or more than halfway. So we're going to look at 1/3. What you want to do is think of 0 to 1 as one whole part, and the 3 is the denominator telling you how many parts to divide that into. So we're going to ignore this for right now, and what you want to see is this is 1/3 of the way down, and then this is another one. So can you see that? I've taken this whole thing and divided into 3 sections. And when I do that, this part is 1/3 of my number line. Oops, I wrote a half. Sorry. I wrote a half. It needs to be 1/3. So you have 1/3. This would be 2/3, and that would be 3/3. That's how we were looking at it. So now I'm going to look at my benchmark fraction. And I see that when 1/3 is on the number line here, that means it's smaller than 1/2 because it comes before 1/2. So if I'm traveling down my number line and say I'm on a trip and I drive 1/3 of the way onto my trip, I have not yet gone halfway. I've only traveled 1/3 of my trip, which means it's not as far as halfway. And I know it looks a little confusing when you see a 2 here and we're telling you that this number is bigger than this number. That in fractions, it's different. Just like when we multiplied and divided fractions, it almost means the opposite. But here, you're looking at 1/3 we know is to be smaller than 1/2. Okay? Now, 5/6. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at this whole part and divide it into 6 pieces. That's what my denominator is telling me to do. So I've got one part here. This I'm going to keep. It's part of the 6 parts because you're going to see that 3 and 6 work well together as fractions. Okay? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are my 6 parts. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I want to show 5/6. So I'm going to travel down my number line and stop at 5/6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5/6. If I had kept going, I would have gotten to 6/6. Now, we're going to figure out where 7/12 goes. Oh, wait a second. Let's take a look at how it compares to our benchmark. So look, because it's traveled and passed that 1/2 benchmark, it's showing us that 5/6 is actually bigger than 1/2. Now, this is a nice way to show you something, another way of when the number line's gone, look at it this way. You want to look at your denominator, and that denominator is 6. And you want to think to yourself, what is half of 6? Half of 6 is 3. And look, 5 is bigger than 3, which means 5/6 is bigger than half of 6, which is bigger than half. So we'll have more of that conversation a little bit. Now we're going to look at 7/12. Now, if you notice, these denominators are pretty friendly. They are all multiples or divisible. So now we're going to divide or take our number line and divide it into 12 parts. Well, if I have 6 parts right here and I want to make 12 parts, I just need to go through and make all of those 6 parts have 2 parts. And what I've done is I've made 12 parts. 7/12. So I'm going to travel down my number line 7 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's 7/12. And I can see that 7/12 is greater than 1/2, but it's actually less than 5/6. So we're going to take a look at what that looks like down here. Now we're going to use the number line as a tool. Eventually, you're not going to need a number line. When you're grown up, well, by the end of 4th grade, you shouldn't need a number line. But the number line is just a visual to help you understand where the fractions, how they compare to one another. So we're going to use the number line in part A to compare the fractions using greater than, less than, or equal to. So let's look at 7/12 right here and compare it to 1/2. And again, think of like you're traveling down, you're going on a trip, you're traveling down this number line. And let's see, if I get here first, I haven't traveled as far as if I've traveled here. So this shows me that 1/2 is actually less than 7/12, or 7/12 is greater than 1/2. You can also look at, like I said before, ask yourself, well, what is 1/2 of 12? 1/2 of 12 is 6. And 7 is bigger than 6, which means it's bigger than 1/2 of that denominator. All right, now we're going to look at 7/12 and compare it to 5/6. Again, we're traveling down this number line. Here's 7/12. We get there first. And then 5/6 is farther down the number line, which means we would travel farther, which is longer and farther in our trip. So 5/6 is going to be greater than 7/12. So another way you can look at this is, again, 1/2 of 12 is 6. 7 is greater than 6, but only by 1. Here, 1/2 of 6 is 3. And 5 is greater than 3, which is greater than 1/2, by 2. So this is going to be bigger than this. All right, I'm going to turn the page over and do a couple on this side. Again, you're looking at the same thing. You can draw a number line anytime you want. But if you think of that benchmark, what is 1/2 of a number? Then that'll help you. So here we have 1/2. Perfect. We have 1/2. Now what you're going to do is think of 4. What is 1/2 of 4? And 1/2 of 4 is 2. Okay? 3 is larger than 2, which means 3 is bigger than 1/2, which means 3/4 is bigger than 1/2. So you're looking at the relationship between this number and what 1/2 of the bottom number is. Let's do this one. So 1/2 and 7/8. So I can look at my 8 and think what is 1/2 of 8? And that is 4. 7 is bigger than 4. So this is bigger than 1/2 of 8. So 1/2 is less than 7/8 because it's bigger. And if you look at 7/8, I mean, that's almost a whole. So that is bigger than 1/2 of what 8 would be. All right, now we're getting a little trickier. We don't have 1/2 anymore. So what you're going to do is look at them individually, okay? Think of what is 1/2 of 3. 1/2 of 3 it's actually 1.5. And 2 is bigger than 1.5, correct? Now look at this one. What is 1/2 of 5? 1/2 of 5 is 2.5. And 2 is smaller than 2.5. So 2/3 is greater than 2/5. And it says to write a brief explanation for each answer, referring to the benchmarks 0, 1/2, and 1. So what we're going to do here is you can say that 2/3 is greater than 1/2. We see this, right? 2/3 is greater than 1/2 because it's actually 1.5. It's greater than 1.5. So 2/5 is less than 1/2. Okay. All right, we'll do one more. We've got 9/10 and 3/5. So think of what is 1/2 of 10, and the answer is 5. And you see that 9 is greater than 5. So you know that this is bigger than 1/2. And then you've got 5. 1/2 of 5 is 2.5. and 3 is greater than 2.5. So these are both greater than 1/2, but this is bigger, much bigger, because this is closer to 1/2 and this is closer to 1 whole. Okay. All right. Hope you guys did okay today. See you tomorrow.